Hi, welcome to Legal Studies. Today we're going to be finishing off looking at our factors affecting justice, and in particular, we're going to be looking at how cultural differences can affect your experience of the justice system. Now, when we're talking about Australia, the really obvious issue that we're going to need to think about is how Indigenous people in Australia experience and interact with our legal system. Uh, and we know that we're coming into this in Australia with a situation where Indigenous people are really massively overrepresented in our prison system. Um, and so today we're going to be thinking about some factors that might explain some of this. But these cultural factors don't just apply to and relate to Indigenous people in Australia. They're broader factors that can affect your experience of justice, no matter which culture you come from, so long as you're coming from a culture that is different to the dominant one. So, for example, language barriers are a really clear and obvious example in the sense that if you don't understand what's happening in the courtroom, you're clearly going to be at a disadvantage. You won't know what's going on, and you won't be able to represent yourself or defend yourself in the best possible way. Other ways in which cultural differences can put a barrier on people's experience of justice is the ways in which different cultures react to direct questioning. So, for example, in some cultures, particularly some Indigenous Australian cultures, um, it is rude to reply to questions in a direct manner. And it would be more common to maybe tell a story about something that has happened and maybe get around to the main point in a more circular way. And this idea of being directly questioned on something and providing a direct answer is not how it might normally be done. And so if you're trying to not directly answer a question, a jury might interpret that as being dishonest, when it might just be an expression of cultural difference. And the same thing can come through with body language. In some cultures, and again in some Indigenous cultures, eye contact with someone can be interpreted as a sign of disrespect. But a jury, particularly a jury comprising all white members, might interpret a lack of eye contact as a sign of disrespect or a sign of dishonesty. And this can flow in through to cultural differences in relation to shyness and submissiveness and how we treat and interact with people in positions of authority. Again, in some cultures, it is seen as disrespectful to disagree with someone in authority. And it is seen as respectful to agree with them, to be submissive to them. And so, in a courtroom context, what that can look like is that a lawyer is, questioning the witness or putting arguments to them and saying, isn't it the case that this is what happened? And even if you don't agree with the lawyer, you might end up agreeing to their questions so as to not appear rude. All right, that is something that has happened quite a lot in Australian history, with many Indigenous defendants. Cultural taboos can affect our delivery of evidence. For example, um, it can be a taboo to mention the dead and names of deceased people in Indigenous cultures. So that too can come across as avoiding the question to someone who's not informed of those cultural differences. And if you're trying to avoid naming a person or talking about a deceased person, that might come across to a jury as dishonesty when it's simply just a difference in culture. And finally, this idea of lack of linguistic barriers or lack of understanding of the language, that can lead to a lack of understanding of court procedure, can disadvantage you. But also, you know, if you're from a different cultural background, no matter what cultural background you're from, if you've got a different process that happens in your country and you're not totally familiar with how it happens in Australia, that sort of lack of familiarity is going to disadvantage you as well. You're going to feel confused, and you're maybe not going to put your best foot forward. So, what are some things that we've done to try and solve or reduce some of these barriers? Well, in terms of Indigenous people and how we've at least tried, to put some solutions in place, we have something called the Koori Court. And that's when an Indigenous person has pleaded guilty to an offence, and rather than being sentenced just by a magistrate or a judge in the formal court setting, it's a much less formal setting. The magistrate is there, but it's around sort of a round table, and it's not just the magistrate; it's the Aboriginal elders of your community, it's your lawyer, it's your family there as well, and everyone is encouraged to take part in the conversation by having a yarn, by avoiding using legal language. And the Aboriginal elders are able to give cultural advice to help the magistrate make a judgment that would be culturally appropriate. And then another obvious solution is, the use of interpreters to avoid language barriers. But this isn't as easy as it seems, particularly for some Indigenous languages. We don't some Indigenous languages don't have a very large population base. We know that a lot of Indigenous languages are slowly dying out, and so there may not be an interpreter available who's able to interpret that language for them, or maybe it has to be a family member of that person. So that it's not so easy as it seems to try and solve this language issue some of the time. And then the last thing that we need to do is to think about how these cultural factors can impact on justice, on fairness, equality, and access. So, for example, in terms of fairness, we were talking about misunderstandings due to cultural differences. If a jury misinterprets what you're doing as dishonesty, that can really seriously disadvantage you in a trial and lead to an unfair outcome. Equality, we have to treat different people differently. And so we might not provide same treatment for everyone in the legal system, and that's okay. If you don't speak English, we can give you a translator. If you do, you don't need one. So that's an example of inequality, but inequality doesn't always have to be bad. And in terms of access, there are lots of ways in which cultural differences can provide barriers to access. If you don't understand the language, you're not able to participate. If you're unfamiliar with how the court system works, you're less able to participate. If we don't have an interpreter for you because you speak a language that we can't find an interpreter for, you're going to be disadvantaged. You're not going to be able to participate as much. So there's all sorts of ways in which cultural differences can have an impact on your experience of justice. And that's it for our cultural factors.